Greetings and durud. Welcome to the latest edition of Farhang Connect, Farhang Foundation's virtual talk series. I am Ali Reza Ardakhani, Executive Director of Farhang Foundation, a non-political, non-religious, not-for-profit organization that thrives with the support of its members. Our sole mission is to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture, enriching the global community at large. Today, we are honored to welcome back to Farhang Connect world-renowned scholar, Professor Abbas Amanat of Yale University, for his special presentation, Searching for Azadi, a history of unfulfilled hopes. Dr. Amanat holds the prestigious position of William Graham Sumner Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. For nearly 4 decades, since 1983, he has been a dedicated educator specializing in the history of early modern and modern Iran, Shi'ism, and the modern Middle East, and the broader Persianate world. He has authored 10 books, most recently, Iran, A Modern History, 2017, and Ahd-e Qajar و Sowda-ye Farang, which was in 2021. He has edited and co-edited 13 volumes and published numerous articles, encyclopedia entries, and Op Eds. His forthcoming books include a study of the solar calendar and Iranian identity, a study of historiography and reconstruction of national identity in Iran, a biography of Fatemah Zarin-Taj Baraghani Qorrat al-Ayn Tahereh, companion of Qajar Studies, and Circle of Justice, Persian Art of Governance. Dr. Amanat has served as the chair of the Yale Council on Middle East Studies and as the director of the Yale Program in Iranian Studies. He was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Iranian Studies, and he is the editor-in-chief of the forthcoming series on sources for the study of the Persianate world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Professor Abbas Amanat here on Farhang Connect. And good afternoon, Dr. Amanat. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your invitation. My thanks are due to the Farhang Foundation and to your, especially to yourself, for a variety of reasons. First of all, for inviting me again to be a speaker in your series, although after 3 years of post-COVID, it seems to me that I'm a bit really, I shouldn't say tired or exhausted, but I would appreciate and welcome a meeting in person or a talk in person rather than on the Zoom. Although the advantage of that, as you've just pointed out, is that we get a much larger number of people when I speak or when anybody speaks on Zoom. Thank you very much also for your very generous and kind introduction, which I think raises the expectations of your audience.
Not at all.
I hope I can really stand to the standards that seem to be in the minds of many of your audience. I'm also thankful to you, Mr. Ardakhani, because of the initial suggestion that I should talk about the concept of Azadi. And specifically, you didn't mention liberty or freedom, but you mentioned Azadi. And that gave me some ideas, which I hope in a moment you would be able to explore a little bit more. Obviously, this is part of the message or the slogan of the 2022 protest movement زن، زندگی، آزادی. And in the process of learning more about it, as a matter of fact, some of my older thoughts about the concept of Azadi gained a new momentum here, which I hope I can share this with you. I had bits and pieces of this of thoughts about the concept of liberty. Obviously, as a historian of the constitutional revolution, you have to. But I'm, in a sense, that's the first time that I try to systematically address the question of liberty in the way that it has evolved, at least since the turn of the 20th century, for the past 120 odd years. And I don't want to scare you by saying that I'm going to cover the entire 120 and 30 years, but there are bits and pieces here and there, which I thought might be of interest to your audience, and also enlightening in terms of what we are dealing with when we talk about the concept of Azadi, as opposed or complementary to the notion of liberty or freedom. I called it I called it a history of unfulfilled hopes. And in order to understand more what I meant by that, although in a number of places, including a recent article in Zamaneh, I have actually explored a little bit in terms of the relationship between the legacy of Azadi and how it emerged, how it evolved and emerged eventually in the protest movement last year. So for those of you who would be interested to learn more, that article of Zamaneh is maybe helpful. Also, though it may sound a little bit of self-promotion, the chapter in my Iran book, I have a whole chapter on the constitutional revolution, which might be of interest for those who would like to explore a little bit more. And also an entry in Encyclopedia Iranica, rather extensive, about the prelude to the constitutional revolution, in which I've also talked at some length about the idea of liberty and the related associated concepts. Now, here, in order to highlight a little bit that history of unfulfilled hopes, I decided that perhaps it would be nice if we start with 4 clips of 2 songs, 2 from each of these 2 songs. Both of them were performed by Mohammad Reza Shajarian, my favorite and many people's favorite vocalist. And both of them were actually composed, that is written, by Houshang Ebtehaj Saye, who is not unusual because he collaborated with Shajarian in a number of albums. The first one, for anybody who has any kind of an insight or interest in Persian music or near contemporary music, is the famous song or the famous tasnif called Sepide, which Shajarian performs at the very end of this fascinating concert that was first performed in 1981 at the height of the 1979 post-1979 revolution, when there were many hopes in the minds of many of the Iranian intellectuals and most people, I would say. And I have decided that I would put both the start of the tasnif and the end of the tasnif. which the message comes through. First, of that of great hope, and at the end of it is a word of caution that unless there would be some unity among various revolutionary forces, then the prospects for Azadi may not be that easily achievable. So, Mr. Adakani, would you kindly play that first one of the two? Thank you. This was number one, which is the start of the song. Let's now move on to the very end of it. Okay, here, even after all these years, when I listen to this album as a whole, and particularly the song at the very end of it, I have some mixed feelings about these hopes for Azadi, which spelled out at the very end that it would only be achieved worldwide if there would be a sense of unity among the revolutionary forces. This was composed in 1979, 1980, actually. And as I heard from Sowda-ye, some passages from this album was actually composed at the very time when they were recording it. So Shajarian was asking him that he wants something for this particular passage, and he would sit behind his typewriter and compose a piece for that particular occasion. I was fascinated to see that there was so much of an interaction between three of them, the third being Muhammad Reza Lutfi, the composer. And that part of that spirit of the time, when there were high hopes about the future of the 1979 revolution. Now, I was even amazed, more amazed to realize that about the same time, that is 1358, that is 1979, 1980, Sowda-ye, Mr. Sowda-ye Farang, also composed another song, or rather another piece of poetry, where I presume it was composed with the idea of a song in mind. It's called Shadi Azadi. And at the time, it was not recorded. Some 30 years later, as far as I can actually find out when that it was turned into a song again, performed by Shajarian. This one composed by Mr. Saket, the famous tar player. And in this, the idea of the joy for the coming of a time of freedom, of Azadi, is much more explicit. And then at the end of it, which is the next part that we're going to hear, the beginning and the end, at the end, the poet's ambivalence and fears of the outcome of a movement that was supposed to bring Azadi into people of Iran becomes very evident. And I think I would ask that perhaps Mr. Ardakani, if you can play part 3, that is number 3, please.
پای تو پیچیده است
ای آزادی آیا با زنجیر می آیی.
Thank you so much. As you have noticed at the start of the, if I try to render the a translation of the beginning of it, O joy of freedom, the day that you'll return with this sorrowful heart of mine, what would I do with you? That's how he starts the tasnif. And then towards the end, it says, but now that you are coming, I tremble in my heart. What is it that you are hiding in your hands? What is it that wrapped around your feet? Oh, freedom, are you coming with chains? So I found this rather moving, given the fact that apparently Shajarian performed this, or rather Kayvan Saket composed it and Shajarian performed it, and in the aftermath of 2009 protest movement. So 30 years later, after it was composed, now we'll hear it bring us a message of a freedom that has come with chains in its hands. This is what I would say, probably a kind of a audio version of what you might say the unfulfilled hopes. Now, as a historian, I have to really delve now into a more historical realities of the period I have in mind. And the first thing that comes to mind is the periodization. What time period are we talking about? Unfulfilled hopes, I would say probably from the time of the Constitutional Revolution, that is the turn of the 20th century to the second or the third decade of the 21st century. That is nearly 120 years, a little bit less than 120 years. However, perhaps in a more specific terms, we probably should talk about the period between 1921 and 2022. That is really, I would say, 100 years of unfulfilled hopes. I mean, following the famous title, beautiful title by Garcia Marquez, 100 years of solitude. Probably here we should speak of 100 years of servitude. I'm not trying to be unkind to the Pahlavi era, and in a moment I would try to explain the trade-off that took place in the period after 1921. But nevertheless, as far as political freedoms are concerned, this is a period of in the very end of the constitutional period. I really think that the constitutional period continued right up to 1921, from 1905, 1906 up to 1921. Normally, people consider the end of it is 1911, end of the 1911. But in my opinion, we can speak of constitution and constitutionalism, the spirit of constitutionalism, right up to 1921. Okay, today now, a century later, what we witness is that, I don't think this is a secret to anybody who is listening to us, a period of intense lack of political and civil liberties, of which the way that the movement of Zan Zindagi Azadi has been suppressed is the greatest example. The fact that 2 Iranian women in the course of the past 20 years were the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize. The second one, Nargis Mohammadi, although it could have been Nasrin Sotoudeh, both of them are remarkable women, is, I would say as a statement about the state of freedom, about the state of civil freedoms, political freedoms in today's Iran. And of course, all the associated institutions with the concept of liberty that over the past century have suffered in one way or another from the presence of autocratic powers, absolute powers, that took over first in the form of the Pahlavi monarchy, and then from 1979 onwards in a much more intense, much more dramatic fashion, the revolution with a very dark record that we are witnessing, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the behavior of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, this lack of liberty or azadi is associated, it's very obvious, but for the sake of just having a sense of what we are talking about, institutions of parliament, pluralism, popular representation, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, all of them in one way or other were compromised or completely were restricted in the course of the past 100 years. This is, in effect, if you would like to look at the larger picture, we would see that there is a sense of end to an ancient symbiosis that Iran has experienced for a very long time, at least since the Sasanian period, pre-Islamic era, between the state and the religious establishment. And this is not, again, something unknown. It always is at the back of my mind that there is in one of these books of the Council to the Kings, actually one of the earliest, called Name Tansar, that presumably belongs to the age of Ardeshir, the founder of the Sasanian period, but it's actually a forgery. It belongs to the 6th century, to the age of Anushiravan. of which we have a translation from Pahlavi to Arabic, from Arabic to Persian. And this is a very nice edition by Mojtaba Minovi. For those of you who are interested, it gives you one prototype of that genre of books of counsel or andars to the rulers that are very prevalent in Persian, as well as in some of them in Arabic, and for that matter in many other cultures. It's called Mirror for Princes. There's Machiavelli is the European example of it. And many others, of course. Here, the emphasis in this particular text and in the following text in the Persian genre of the counsel to the kings is the concept of the sisterhood of these two institutions. That is the institution of the state. That means monarchy when we talk about the state, and kingship, that is padishahi in Persian, and the other one, the institution of the religious institution, which in effect actually means the clerical establishment. Whether, of course, cleric is not a very exact, accurate term for priesthood or whatever else, the equivalent of it that we have. But the concept of the religious establishment being Zoroastrian or Islamic, being Sunni or Shi'i, always carried the same kind of a spirit of this symbiosis or association or alliance, of unspoken alliance between these two institutions. As the Nameh Tansar points out, these are two sisters. Do khahar hamzadan. Those are twin sisters that one cannot survive without the other. It's a kind of a Siamese twins that the survival of one is guaranteed by the other. It's a kind of a very conservative concept of authority of political culture that is very much Iranian. As a matter of fact, other cultures that associated the origins of it can go to this Persian notion of the sisterhood of these two institutions. That sisterhood in modern times, one of the major changes that came about, was basically brought to an end. Partly in the Pahlavi era, where the emergence of a modernizing, secularizing, strong man, such as Reza Shah Pahlavi, put the religious establishment in isolation, sent them back to their madrasas, made them irrelevant in many respects as far as the changes in the society is concerned, were concerned. And then, of course, the response to that, as it's very known to all of us, is the re-emergence of the religious establishment in a different garb of political Islam, and for that matter, radical political Islam, which was a kind of a bypass in order to make themselves more relevant at the time when they had lost much of their, or rather they failed to modernize in other respects. But that's not the time to talk about that. But it's just one acknowledgement of the fact that now we are facing a situation when the religious establishment took over, or rather usurped, the authority of the state. We no longer have these two institutions, but have one for the first time perhaps in Islamic history, and in many respects one can say for the first time in world history that we are witnessing that phenomenon. That has repercussions for the idea of liberty. Second is that idea of this strong kingship, that the idea of reverence for the greatness of the kingship, nevertheless as an autocratic institution survived, even up to today in the Islamic Republic. It always is, in my mind, to think that the time period between the departure of Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi and the arrival and the attempt to try to control the entire political system in 1979 was perhaps more about a month or a little bit more than that. And that speaks to me about the endurance of this legacy of a strong leader, even if it is not a kind of a charismatic figure. Nevertheless, it seems that Iran did not escape with the revolution of 1979 from this rather bitter reality. The third factor that seemed to affect the survival or in a sense the weakening of the institutions, democratic institutions, and the idea of Azadi is the fact that the regime today in power, as well as the Pahlavi regime, in the past, successfully managed to indeed eliminate or very profoundly weaken political organizations, and they were basically eliminated from the way that these regimes ruled over Iran. I would add to that by saying that the fourth factor that corresponded to this lack of political freedom in Iran is the economic resources that in the 20th century became available to the state, be it the state of the post-constitutional period, the state of the early Pahlavi, much more extensively in the late Pahlavi era, and of course extensively in the Islamic Republic and up to today. The fact that these resources, that is underground resources, that is oil and gas that is available, the revenue from which makes the state much more powerful than ever before in the history of Iranian political history of Iran. And one might say even less accountable or unaccountable to the citizens of the country. So basically, that's part of the reality of what we see at the expense of institutions, of democratic institutions, and the concept of Azadi. That being said, this was just a quick summary. That being said, I wouldn't say that we should lose hope about the future of a democratic Iran and for the revival of the notion of freedom. The fact that we have this slogan, this message of Zan Zendegi Azadi, originally from Kurdish, and apparently, as far as I know, the genealogy of it goes back to the Kurdish communities of Syria, northern Syria, where they're fighting against the Daesh. That's presumably where the notion of Zan Zendegi Azadi first emerged in Kurdish, and then, of course, very much welcomed and became part and parcel of the aspirations of the Iranians of the younger generation in 2022. Why this is related to what we are talking about is not only because of the fact that these three components, perhaps accidentally, were put together. I don't think any of those who first composed this message, I may be wrong, but my sense is that none of them really looked into the origins of these terms, particularly the etymology of these terms. which to me are quite remarkable. Women being at the core of this message. Then, of course, life, as one might say, the American version of it, the pursuit of happiness, is what Zendegi is about. And the liberty as political liberties, or the Azadi. That's at least the way I see it. And then, of course, to my surprise, although I had some idea about it before, when I was doing a little bit of research about this talk, I came across a very remarkable connection between these three terms. These are not just because they rhyme together, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, and sounds very attractive. But as a matter of fact, there is I would say, etymological symbiosis or connection between these three concepts. I hope I'm not making this up. I'm not I'm not a scholar of language. I'm interested in etymology, though, and I often go back to ideas of etymological origins of the terms and concepts, because it gives us some insight, and I hope in this case it also would do so. Okay, as you can see, I tried to sum up a very complex etymological connection between the concepts that we've been just talking. That is Azadi, if you look at it, how it connects to, how it relates to the concept of women, Zan, and to the concept of Zendegi. And if you start with Azadi in the reverse order, as a matter of fact, you see in the first line, the Persian word Azadi, in a regular meaning of liberty or freedom, but also, curiously enough, in the course of its long history in Persian language, it also acquired the concept of worshipping, and particularly worshipping God. Azadi kardan, even in Shahnameh, presumably means worshipping either God or a higher authority, or paying homage to a higher authority. From the word azad, that in modern Persian, in Middle Persian, Pahlavi, and in Old Persian, means azad, that is a nobleman, a man or a person who is not a slave. So in effect, the definition of azad is closely corresponds to the notion of slavery, since a large segment of the Iranian population of the presumably Sasanian era, like many other communities worldwide, accepted the concept of slavery, and there was a class of non-slaves, which usually are the azadegan, or those that are free people. And by free people, meaning that they are not slaves. These are the noble men, hardly we can say noble women, noble men, and the class of the aristocrats in the society. As you can see, that word, azad, azad, the one who is. This is, by the way, not azad, because a and a in ancient, in Old Persian and Middle Persian, that is in Pahlavi, have a different meaning. A here is basically emphasizing the concept of the freedom, or the freeborn, that is a nobleman. It comes from the Persian word zad, which is quite familiar, and zadan, to give birth. The initial meaning of it comes from the Indo-European origin of a very crucially important, as one of the most important terms in the European origins of the Indo-European languages. That is gen, G-E-N, or gen, which means origin. I suppose we can say that it's the origin. The sign next to it is that means the root. That's the radical, means the root. There are numerous derivatives of this term in virtually all the Indo-European languages. In English, those who are very familiar are genes and genius. In Persian, John, meaning life. The term Farzane and Farzin, in Persian, both of them meaning wise. All also are derivatives from gen. And even in Arabic, which seems to have been adopted the term from Indo-European languages, most likely from Persian or maybe other Indo-European languages, and it appeared in Arabic as gen. So these are all coming from the same origin of the gen, the Indo-European gen. Now, if you move further, we can see that the word zan in Persian, contrary to languages, European languages, which means meaning of a woman means that a non-man woman, here has a certain centrality of its own, which, although again the emphasis on reproduction, procreation, it comes from the Old Persian word jan, Kurdish jan, and again coming back, the roots of it is the word John, life, and zayesh, that is to give birth. That is procreativity. That, as you can see, has a common root with the word Azadi and with the word Zendegi, which again, Persian Zendegi means living and life, from the term Zende, life, the state of being alive, again from Zan and Zayesh, and Zende meaning Zendegi, the state of being alive. So that to me speaks a lot about the way that this message, perhaps quite accidentally, or I don't know how much awareness of the genealogical origins of it, the etymological origins of it, becomes significant. And for understanding that Azadi is a term that, although, as I just pointed out, rather vulnerable against the forces that over the past 100 years had made it very hard to have a kind of a healthy life, in certain respect, it has a very inherent presence in the Iranian context, or for that matter, in the European context. But in the Iranian context, the Iranian languages, it is very, very evident. And I was rather amazed the way that these interact or interrelate. That being said, I would like to move on and talk about how indeed this concept of Azadi, if you've seen the origins of it here, has been dealt with in the culture of Islam, particularly Islamic Sharia or Islamic jurisprudence. What I would like now to talk about is that although the concept of Azadi was revered in its original meaning of not being a slave, a free man, and also the acquired meaning of worshiping God or paying homage to God, that is Azadi kardan, nevertheless has within the context of the Islamic Sharia, Islamic law or jurisprudence, fiqh, has acquired certain limits, that there are certain restrictions, put hudud in the technical terms for it, on the above notion of freedom, to which is always referred to with the Arabic title Hurriya, which is again an old concept, almost equal to Azad in Persian, and with its origin going back to pre-Islamic Arabia, whereby there were a concept of a free man vis-a-vis numerous forms of slavery, of which Mawali is the one that Iranians are very familiar with, since many of the Iranians after the conquest of the early Islamic period became the clients, as it was often being translated, of certain tribes, since the Arabian system of tribal system would not have recognized any identity unless it would be connected or related to a certain tribe. These affiliates, or the clients, were mostly Iranians. There were some Berber in North Africa, but most of them were the Iranians, and they were playing an enormously important part in the late Umayyad period, and a major force in bringing about the Abbasid revolution and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, of which perhaps the most famous as far as the Iranians are concerned is Abu Muslim Khorasani. He was a Mawali, meaning a slave or a client. But there were, of course, other concepts of Mamluk is another form of slavery. The idea of Abd and Ibad is another concept of servitude. And there are even more, which we don't want to go in too much into it because it takes too much of time. Back to the idea of hudud, the question raises that why there should be a hudud and the concept of Azadi. The reason for that is that it has been assumed that total freedom is a state of transgression, both in legal and in moral terms. And therefore, there has to be some limits to the concept of Azadi. And this is not a surprise. We can find both in Judaism and in Christianity, all the so-called Western religions have the same notion of defining and restricting the boundaries of Azadi, or boundaries of freedom, human freedom. In pre-Enlightenment era, for instance, up to the 18th century, you see that this concept in European Christianity or European culture as a whole would define the unlimited freedom with the concept of libertine, and which is usually defined as a person with no moral principles, especially in sexual matters. And even up to today, libertine has that kind of a connotation, as opposed to the concept of liberal, which is considered as a concept of freedom, or liberty as a concept of freedom, which in a sense acknowledges the restrictions on the notion. In Islamic context also, we would see two areas in particular are by the definition of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, the idea of promoting the good and preventing the evil, which is one of the principles of the Islamic belief system, and certainly an important part of it for the concept of restrictions on Azadi, in which there is the idea of moral, particularly sexual morality, is associated with with the is one of the concerns for why there should be restrictions. That in Arabic and Persian is closely associated with the concept of namus, which is obviously from the Greek word nomos, which means the foundation or the structure of everything. That's called namus. And this is very closely associated with sexual boundaries in marriage or in any kind of a relationship. And it was usually closely associated, and that's why we should, it has a place in our presentation here, with the concept of hijab. So hijab, particularly facial hijab or bodily hijab as a whole, for women is closely associated with the concept of preserving the namus in the society. For instance, in Persian poetry, it's always amazed me. There's so many allusions to this concept of preservation of the namus, that if is going to be transgressed, if it's going to be breached, then it would bring a fitna, which in classical Islamic sense is a reference to the revolution, if you like to call it, or that comes at the end of the time. There's an apocalyptic connotation into the term of namus in this respect, when it refers to sexual chastity and modesty. And particularly the removal of the facial veil is the one major feature, symbolic feature of how this nomos may be broken. I was looking at many, I was looking at some of the ghazals by Azadi, for instance, or Hafiz, both of them have this. I only read one verse from Azadi, which emphasizes this concept of if the facial veil is removed, that would bring, in a sense, the moment of resurrection and the fitna of the end of the time. It says, magar to روی بپوشی و فتنه باز نشانی که من قرار ندارم که از تو دیده بپوشم. Unless you restore your veil and alleviate the chaos of the fitna of the end of the time. For I have no intention of taking my eyes from you. But there's a double entente here, the two meanings into it, or you can translate it as no obligation. I have no obligation to forgive you because you have removed the veil. What is important here is this association that I just pointed out. That's one aspect of it. And that's why hijab seemed to have been, for a whole history of at least early modern and modern, at least since the time of Shi'ism becoming the official creed of the Safavid Empire and afterwards up to the present, seem to have played a very important part in the minds of many of the jurists. And in the work of the jurists, you would find a great deal about the intricacies of what and how these restrictions should be applied in moral terms. There is other side, however, to it, and that is the concept of the hududs are needed in order to restrict human freedom, not to slide into the world of heresy. So here the orthodoxy of the Sharia is contrasted clearly to the concept of heresy or heterodoxy, if you like to call it. In Persian, maybe translated as farakishi. That is, kish, if it's the Sharia, is the kish. Farakish means all those trends, and there were plenty of them, particularly in the Iranian world, that challenged the idea of the conventionality and the centrality of the standards of the Sharia. And that perhaps to our mind in the third decade of the 21st century doesn't mean much, but in the minds of many people in the earlier centuries, particularly in the course of the 16th century to the present, the concept is very, very significant when there were numerous examples of heresy that challenged the authority of the religious establishment. Now, if you move on a little bit to the idea that how this concept of the Hurriya or Azadi or freedom that has been considered frowned upon even by the religious establishment as something that loosens the control over the individual or the individual believer, and the task of course, the authorities of religious establishment is to police and control the limits of this freedom. Then how these notions of freedom, the way that we know it and we praise it, comes about. And of course, the idea of liberty in that context always has a complementary term of tyranny or despotism, that it also emerges into the vocabulary of modern times in Iran since the Constitutional Revolution. If you look prior to the time of the Constitutional Revolution, we would see that the concept of istibdad, term that was first enters into Persian from Arabic during the time of the Constitutional Revolution, does not exist. There are certain terms that emphasizes the tyranny of the ruler. Jabbar is one of them, tyrant. Ja'ir is particularly the legal terms, the Shi'i fiqh legal terms associated with it. And these terms comes usually in contrast to the idea of liberty. Well, obviously, if you look back into the genealogy of this terminology, most of them are the product, if not all of them, are the product of the French Revolution, or for that matter, if you go backward to the middle of the 18th century, the time of the philosophe, the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, so-called Age of Enlightenment. And although these days many of the historians, European historians, question the centrality of these terms in the way that the French Revolution came about, or other revolutions came about, but nevertheless, these ideas had a certain life of their own as they gradually traveled from the philosophical discourse of the mid-18th century into political message and the political slogans of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and then, of course, continued to the 19th century. One major figure, obviously, in this discourse of liberty versus despotism is, of course, Montesquieu. That, again, is not a surprise to say that much of what comes through the Constitutional Revolution and becomes available to Iranians is the product of writings of the Montesquieu. And of course, Montesquieu relies very much on the concept of despotism in Aristotelian context. And in Aristotelian context, that's also quite remarkable that it was associated with the Persian Empire, that is with the Achaemenid Empire, to which Aristotle refers to as the Persian despotism. So the concept of Persian despotism, it's not surprising, therefore, that this term has a life of its own from the Aristotelian context into the Enlightenment with people like Montesquieu. It was not the only one. And it's not only also, in my opinion at least, it's not an accident that he has lettres persanes, the Persian letters, because that is where the idea of liberty versus despotism becomes very explicit. And of course, it's in a Persian context. I have one passage here from letter 102 that is in 1717 produced by Montesquieu, apparently on the model of earlier Italian letters, Persian letters, in which one of the two characters, Uzbek, is talking when he's in Smyrna, Izmir. This is all, of course, imaginary, to a Ben. And the text is this: it is a state of violence that always degenerates into despotism or into a republic. It is remarkable that he sees that chaos either goes by the way of despotism or by the way of republic. The power can never be equally divided between the people and the prince as a representative of a despotic power, and people as members of a republican community. The balance is too difficult to be preserved, and the power must decrease on one side whilst it increases on the other. But the balance is generally in favor of the prince, who is at the head of the armies. So it's very interesting to see that in 1717, Montesquieu acknowledges the fact that the fate of many of these debates between the despotism and liberty is usually decided by the power of the army. And for many of us, this is not a surprise, as it has actually evolved in the case of Iranian idea of liberty versus despotism. However, there is a way that a philosophical idea, a political philosophy of a person like Montesquieu, or for that matter, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who played a very important part in that regard, to turn into easily tangible notions of political slogans. And this, in the case of liberty, equality, and fraternity, occurs probably between the late 18th century and during, ultimately finalizes in around 1790s during the Age of Terror. American Revolution, of course, it's no secret that it played quite an important part in the way that the philosophe basically conceptualized the idea of freedom and the message of liberty, equality, or components of the message of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Here, as you can see, there are some early political propaganda posters that were produced during the French Revolution and during the Age of Terror under Robespierre. As you can see, the first one on the left, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, et une mort, was a placard that announcing actually sale of expropriated properties. Whenever they had some musadere, I use the Persian word for it. They had to put this label on it in order to legitimize the act of expropriating other people's property. And this seems to be one of the earliest. The one on the right next to it is a more elaborate propaganda poster about the same time, 1793, in which, as you can see, unity and indivisibility of the republic is associated with the concept of liberty, equality, and fraternity. That is, at the time of the revolution, the notion of the possibility of secession movements was becoming more evident, and therefore this should have been part of the message of the republic as being one and not divided. And then if you look at the one at the bottom left, it's another propaganda poster of Paris 1790s thereabout that basically makes fun of the concept of a three-state or three-État parliament, and that was first convened in the 1780s and then continued into 1790s. Here, as you can see, the third class, the État généraux, is carrying on its back the first État, or the first class, the nobility, and the second class, the clergy. So already there is an awareness of the fact that the age of freedom cannot simply be defined in terms of the three classes are equal, but rather the idea of exploitation is very much present, as it shows in this caricature. Here again, it's an interesting poster that contrasts particularly the year 1793, the Reign of Terror, in France, as it was shown or symbolized on the right, as the Marion, the symbolization of a French nation, is shown to hold in his hand a symbol of violence with the severed head at the top of what seems to be a spear. And of course, on the left, it is the British liberty. There's a comparison between the French and the British liberty, whereby religion, morality, loyalty, and so on, obedience and so forth, are all associated with the British liberty, whereas the French were considered as atheists, purgers, and in a number of other evil behaviors, such as anarchy, murder, has been associated with the French. Well, the rivalry between the two nations is very old, as it has been rightly argued. Neither of these two nations or these two countries took the full form of a self-identity with their land without this kind of a contrast, of which you can see an example here. I brought this here in order to show that even in the 1790s, although the concept of liberty was revered by the majority population, it was also had a great number of its own critiques. All right. If we move on then to the next one, whereby we have a kind of, as part of this process of transfer of the notion of tyranny, particularly, you can see, I have provided you with one example of the translations, an example of the translations and adaptations of Western works of political philosophy published during the Constitutional Revolution. So Iranians are the receiving end, in a sense, of a long tradition of ideas then ideas of dissent as far as the concept of liberty and the associated notions are concerned. If you can see, the translator of a very widely read kind of a treatise produced in 1907, year 1325 of the Qamari calendar in Tehran. This was a lithographic publication, is by Abdul Hussein Mirza Qajar. Curiously enough, a Qajar, who is actually coming from a rather significant line in the Dolachahi line of the Qajars, is the one who actually attempts to translate a text which is was read and understood as being anti-Qajar, as a model of istibdad. It's called Tabayul Istibdad, the modes of despotism. And presumably it was even, he claims, or partly probably claims because he wants to stay safe, that this was instructed or commissioned by the ruler, presumably Muhammad Ali Shah, or maybe Muzaffar Ali Shah, but I think Muhammad Ali Shah. This is a translation of a work by Abdurrahman Kawakabi, a famous Aleppan writer and activist, political activist, with the same title, Tabayul Istibdad, published anonymously in Arabic rendering that appeared first in 1899 as a series of newspaper articles, newspaper serial. That itself was a translation from another work of an anonymous author that presumably was Ahmad Jefdat Pasha, one of the men of Tanzimat, one of the Rejals of Tanzimat era, fairly important, fairly well accomplished, also with a knowledge of Persian, poet as well, who had apparently, I couldn't put my hand on the actual text. There is an Ottoman Turkish translation that was used by Kawakabi in Arabic. That was the immediate source for Abdul Hussein Mirza. Here, the text is seemed to have been a rendering of another work of an anonymous author, which was much more clear who he was, Vittorio Alfieri, della Tranide, or della Tranide, about despotism, that was first published in 1777, and then a more complete edition came out in 1800. And itself, from what he says, was an adaptation from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Law, the famous work of Montesquieu in 1748. So the rendering in 4 translations eventually is the idea that comes to Iran and finds a great reception. There are numerous translations of Tabayul Istibdad from Arabic into Persian, which by itself is interesting, up to even more recent times. And in my opinion, speaks volumes about, and there no pun is intended here, about the lack of freedom, and that many of the terms of what they read in Tabayul Istibdad from the time of the Constitutional Revolution still make sense in our time. Okay, here I have tried to show in pictures. The first on the left is the first edition of Montesquieu, which actually without the name of the author, that is also remarkable. And this appears, the first edition appears in Geneva and not in France in 1749 for very obvious reasons, that at the time publications would have been very hazardous because of what would have happened to the author. This appears again by Alfieri in 2 volumes in Torino in 1800. This is a year, as you can see, the year 9 of the revolutionary calendar, of the French Revolution calendar, that starts from year 1 and goes on. This is the year 9, corresponds to year 1800. And then Jevdet Pasha, that we couldn't find the title. And then Kabakibi in this Al-Amal al-Kamila is a collection of his essays. And then finally, the one that you see on the right is the first page. Unfortunately, I don't have the original lithograph, but I found this online. As this is the first page, the opening page of the Persian translation. And what interested me is that, as you can see, there are numerous stamps on it. And the way that this manuscript, this lithograph, very rare lithograph edition, has been passed from one library to another. I found 3 of them. It was the Melli Library, and then Kitabkhane Majlis Shura'i Islami, and then eventually ended up in the library of some college. So I just wanted you to have a sense of this. Moving on, in terms of the transfer of these ideas as it comes from the Age of Enlightenment into the slogans of the French Revolution, and therefrom, after a long delay of more than a century, eventually comes into the Iranian disposal. One of the earliest of such publications in Iran, that for the first time around 1906-1907 basically celebrated the idea of freedom, the slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, is Surah Israfil. But what I found in it particularly remarkable is the way that both visually and in terms of the description, the idea has been very much Persianized. And I think this is one of the great talents or abilities of the Persian culture, that it manages to adopt from other cultures and make it its own. So this is an answer to many of the people who erroneously claim that the constitutional revolution is a kind of a complete translation of a European notion of the constitution. Yes, there has been a great deal of influence, but yet at the same time, we can see that it was conceptualized, it was understood very much in Persian term. By now probably you've read the passage that I translated, part of it on the bottom right, the first column. It says, the age of horror and terror has come to an end, and the time of happiness and progress has arrived. The age of misery and despair is over. This is the revival of Iran's history and start of its new life. The tongue and the pen are freed to serve the beneficial affairs for the land and the nation. Newspapers and the press are liberated to publicize the good and the evil of the country. Multiple newspapers with fresh directions, like brilliant stars, are brightening the homeland's horizon. So both the style and the spirit behind the style clearly shows that how this basically message of the French Revolution now has been adopted in the milieu of the constitutional revolution. As you can see, also something remarkable about this legend of the newspaper is that Mirza Jahangir Khan Shirazi, who was the editor of this weekly journal, gives the 3 dates for this. On number 1, this is the 17th of Rabiul Sani of 1325 Qamari, that corresponds to the 30th of May 1907. And all of this comes, as you can see, on the right under the legend. And then it corresponds to the year Yazde-Gerdi Parsi, that's the Zoroastrian calendar. This is 14th of the month of Day in year 1276. This is not the Khorshidi calendar, but it's a calendar that was preserved by the Zoroastrians and was in use both within Iran for liturgical purposes and also to some extent among the Parsis of India. Okay, so can we move to the next one? Here we are. This is number 3 of the same journal. And this is the one that was used in the poster that very nicely and kindly created by the Farhang Foundation. And my head seemed to cover, as you can see, the word Hurriyat that appears in the band in the hands of in the hand of the angel seraphim, and says Hurriyat, as you can see in the bottom right. Perhaps I can use this. Is it visible if I use the cursor?
No.
No, it's not.
I can show it.
You can show the Hurriyat at the bottom. There it is. Yes. Hurriyat. The next one is Musavat in the middle, and the word Ukhuwat, fraternity, on the left. Well, what is most significant in this legend is the fact that the moment of awakening, or the whole concept of a constitutional revolution, has been conceptualized as a moment of resurrection, as with apocalyptic resurrection. This is the end of the time, whereby the seraphim is blowing in his trumpet, sur, to announce basically the end of the time of people, the dead, and the rising of the nation. So in a sense, the old concept that is very familiar to Iranians are now being used in order to define what the constitutional revolution is all about. And this is not the only one. Many of the newspapers of the time, Najm al-Saqib, Ruh al-Quds, all of these, the same newspapers that he mentions, Jahangir Khan mentions in the editorial of the first issue, are indeed have this kind of a apocalyptic notion that the end has come. Not the end physically of the world, but the end in terms of the coming of a new age, the end of the age of tyranny and despotism in the past, and now the age of a freedom and happiness. What it's also interesting in this is the use of the Quranic verses in order to legitimize the concept of the awakening of the people and the whole concept of the mashruta, the whole concept of the constitution. Is at the top, وَنَفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَإِذَا هُمْ مِنَ الْأَجْدَاثِ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يَنْسِلُونَ. And the trumpets shall be blown. Then behold, they are sliding from their tombs onto the awakening of the constitutional revolution. The term bidari often was used for it, as in Tahereh Bidari Iranian. Here was visualized in the way that people are rising. As you can see on the left, it's Mount Damavand, which is in the process of exploding, and on the right is the city of Tehran, as you can see in the background. The second verse says, "Then when the trumpet is blown, there will be no kinship among them." That is the concept of the equality that Jahangir Khan and his colleagues are adopting to show that the verses in the Quran is supportive of the concept of the Constitution. So this is, if we can move on to the next slide. This was not simply accepted by the majority population. Of course, the pro-constitutionalist forces in the years from 1905 to 1907, and actually all the way to 1908, when the coup of the 1908 occurred and resulted in the bombardment of the Majlis and the end of the first constitution. This was a passage that I found in Mehdi Qoli Khan Hidayat, Mukhbir al-Saltaneh is a man of all seasons that was in the service of the Qajar court, and coming from a family of the notables with quite a significant record, grandson of Reza Qoli Khan Hidayat, the author, the historian of the mid-19th century. This is by the end of the 19th century. Mehdi Qoli Khan Hidayat is one of the notables, the Rejal, who are composing the earliest version of the Constitution, the Nizamname version, during the period of 1906-1907. However, later on, Mukhbir al-Saltaneh shifts position and becomes more critical of the constitutionalists because of the fact that he considers their introduction and advocacy of liberty, fraternity, and equality in certain respect, not only against the what he would call the principles of Islam, but against the best vested interest of the ruling elite, of which he was a member. So only a short passage of it I have translated here. Gradually, as the story of freedom and liberty and the practice of equality and equity among nations, he uses the word melal, the plural of millat, by which he means religious communities. That's the original meaning of the word millat. Not nation as we know it today, but minorities or religious communities. Anyway, and equity among nations was put across, that is in the Majlis, which were contrary to the stipulation of the book, that is the Quran, and the traditions, uses the Hadith and Sunnah, and opposite to the religion of the sublime Prophet of Islam, and against the consensus of Shi'i jurists. And besides, it was evidently pertaining to other corrupt and improper ideas. Hence, he, that is a reference to Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, turned away from the Majlis and took residence in the sacred corner that is in the shrine of Masum Qom. Why he brings this here by itself is important, because it shows, I actually didn't check to see what's the date of authorship of Guzarish Iran, but it has to be probably a little bit later, around perhaps in the 19 teens that he has composed this. And it's a kind of a brief chronological history of Iran from, I forgot from what date he starts. But anyway, the passage shows that Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, who here is the one that initiates the opposition to the idea of liberty and other constitution or other terminology associated with liberty, appears here. Next one, please. By the way, let me just add this to it. Reza Qoli Khan Hidayat was I believe, the great grandfather of Sadiq Hidayat. And Hidayat, perhaps consciously, makes a kind of fun of Mukhbar Sultanate, as he is portrayed in his novelette called Haji Agha, that perhaps some of you have read. I don't think Haji Agha is exactly Mukhbar Sultanate, although he was always referred to as Haji Mukhbar Sultanate. But also is a kind of a composite figure, Haji Agha. And some of the characteristics of Haji Agha corresponds to what we've seen. Can we go back to the previous slide for a moment, please? Yes. Here, the fact that he says that the idea of liberty and is not only against the Quran and against the Prophet or the son of the Prophet, but it's also against these corrupt ideas are against the religious establishment and against, as he put it, it was evidently pertaining to other corrupt and improper ideas. In Persian, after به اضافه سایر مفاسد و معایب مشهوده. So he himself also associates the liberty as something dangerous for the future of the Constitution, since obviously being a member of the notables, the Rejal, he is quite a good candidate to be critical of the slogan of freedom. Next one, please. Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri is known to many of you, and we don't have enough time really to discuss him, but he was the chief champion of anti-constitutional front, consisting of majority of them of either higher ranks or the middle rank of the mullahs, of the clergy in Iran, across Iran, as well as some in the Atabat, in southern Iraq shrine cities. He, in protest to the constitutionalists, the story of it you can read in other places. So there are plenty of stuff published about the constitutional revolution. The idea is that he breaks away from the constitutionalists, although in the earlier stages he was supportive. He was a major faqih, he was a major jurist of the late 19th century. And he moves along with a group of his followers, many of them mujtahids or middle rank ulama, from Tehran, goes to Qom and takes refuge, as Hidayat pointed out, takes refuge in the shrine of Masum in Qom in protest to the constitutionalists. And in order to publicize his objections, he produces a lithographic journal called Lawayeh. Lawayeh, Arabic, the plural for layehe or lo, both of them of the same origin. And my sense is that he names them as Lawayeh in order to compete with the idea of layeha, which is the bill that members, the deputies can put across in the Majlis. Now, here he goes into great detail. This is a periodic publication. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to see that he is conscious of the fact that even in order to combat the constitutionalists, he has to adopt instruments of modernity. So he purchases, or he orders the purchase of a lithographic press from Tehran. At the back of the mules were brought to Qom, were brought to the shrine, and there he starts publishing his Lawayeh. Lawayeh in many respects is very interesting because here we hear the voice of protest of anti-secularism and anti-message of the constitutional period, that is that of freedom. And he's very explicit about it. It's not a surprise, therefore, that he's today one of the heroes of the Islamic Republic. Highways named after him, buildings named after him, his works were all published. And he was considered as a champion of the constitutional revolution. The person who was the villain of the constitutional movement has changed in the textbooks of the Islamic Republic into a hero. I remember sometimes when students that I have encountered coming from Iran, when you would discuss with them the constitutional revolution, the idea of a secular wing of the revolution was completely forgotten and deliberately by the Islamic Republic. And a person such as Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri were brought into the forefront. He says on page 29 or page 28 on the left, that all the people on earth should have equal rights, and the Zimmis, the people of the book, and the Muslims are equal in blood and can mingle and marry one another, and that is long live equality. So he criticizes, it's a very, very harsh language that he uses in order to criticize the idea of equality. Then on the passage on the right, you can see, he says, this is a short passage that they translated. Those fireworks, the idea of firework was something new at the time, that he associates with Western habits. Coming and going of foreign representatives, adopting the foreign habits. Those who raise, he was even against the people supporting the constitution by hoorays. And those banners, long live equality and fraternity, he again criticizes. And then the next page, which I haven't included, he says, where are your messages of the greatness of the Sharia? Where are your messages about the greatness of Islam? So he's very critical of the constitutionalists. If we move to the next one, even more critical. Here we are. Here, the passage that he uses, two of them, first from the one on the left, page 32, it says, one of the foreign laws they, that is the constitutionalists, have translated, that is not translation, I mean, it's all exaggeration here, says that press is completely free, which means that whatever anyone published, no one can absolutely raise any objections. This law does not comply with our Sharia. So it's very open. in his criticism of the Sharia, in his criticism of the various articles of the Constitution, or rather the supplement to the Constitution in 1907, which is much more important than the Constitution itself. Supplement is much more expensive. And in these passages, he also constantly appeals to the higher authorities, himself being a major figure, to the high mujtahids in Iran and in Qom to join him. And actually, somewhere I've counted that at least in one of the statements that put across, I don't think it's in Lavoie, it's somewhere else, 70 mujtahids signed and supported Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri. This tells me that the anti-constitutional rhetoric or anti-constitutional front was quite significant. It's not just one person. There was a whole bunch of them. And time and again, you see that he brings the name of many of the supporters of his among the religious establishment. More interesting is the passage on page 33, next one, whereby I have just translated part of it. And by the rule of the Sharia, no one has the right to publish books that could mislead people. And no one can write in a base and provocative fashion about Islam. That's what he calls base and provocative. That is meaning critical. And distribute such material among people. Therefore, what is the ground for the publication of books by the Frenchman Voltaire, which are all abuses of the prophets of God? And what are the grounds for the publication in newspapers of the bayan of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi the Bab and the writings of Mirza Hossein Ali Takuri, i.e., he means Nuri, he means Baha'u'llah. I think purposefully not using the term Nuri, using the term Takuri, which is the state of the family of Baha'u'llah, because he himself is a Nuri, Sheikh Fazlullah, and wants to differentiate between himself and his enemies. So he says here, why bayan of Sayyid Muhammad Ali Shirazi, Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi the Bab, and the writings of Mirza Hussain Ali Takuri and his brother, that is Yahya Sobh Azadar, and his son, that is Abdul Baha, and Mirza Muhammad Ali, the other, because he says sons, and the other brother of, the other son of Baha'u'llah, who are the God and the Prophet and the Imam of the Babis. And what are the grounds for the publication of sacrilegious tablets containing profanities that refute the ulama of Islam? These are entirely against the Quranic law and are prohibited and banned by those and banned. But these faithless people, that's the constitutionalists, would like to leave these doors open so that they can achieve their ultimate objectives, meaning that completely trying to eliminate Islam. That's the way that he portrays the constitutionalists in the Lavoie. The text of the Lavoie, through and through, almost in every page, is an attack on the Babis, since he considers the entire constitutional revolution as nothing but a Babi conspiracy, or occasionally refers to atheists. So either they are atheists or the Babis. These are the two categories that becomes very evident in this work. Why this is important is because it shows us that the opposition from the religious establishment to the very foundation of democratic institutions and concepts such as liberty and equality is so strong and indeed very effective. One can say that Sheikh Fazlullah and his supporters provided the, if you like to call it, the legal or intellectual grounds for what happened in the August of 1908, that is bombardment of the Majlis by the Cossacks headed by Liakhov, and the end of the first constitution, the first Majlis. So that being said, I think the idea goes on to, in the following years, to basically motivate many of the religious figures of the post-constitutional period, and perhaps to Ayatollah Khomeini. Here you can find, as a matter of fact, between Lavayeh and many of the statements of Ayatollah Khomeini, a direct line. Now, the final part, which I very briefly would like to go through, is the fact that what happens in reality, what happens historically. The debate here between the supporters of the Constitution and the ideas of liberty and the whole doctrine of a constitutional society vis-a-vis the religious establishment is the fact that the rise of Reza Khan and the Reza Shah and the whole period of Reza Shah, in effect, was an attempt to try to find an answer to the issue of this contrast and confrontation between the constitutionalists on the one side and their opponents among the religious establishment, among certain sectors of the notables of the Qajar period, the nobility of the Qajar period. And the outcome of it remains really ambivalent. What becomes very clear is that the age of Reza Shah, and perhaps one can say the entire Pahlavi period, with the interlude of the period of the Second World War, post-Second World War, 1941, abdication of Reza Shah, to the fall of Mossadegh in 1953. It's this period that basically is 12, 13 years, that if you leave that aside, the whole concept of political freedom goes eclipse, and this does not really plays a very significant part in the discourse of modernity. Political modernity does not emerge in this period, and gradually is pushed to the background. What becomes significantly evident, and in a sense a source for the success of the Pahlavi regime, is that it gradually replaces, at the expense of basically setting aside political modernity and notions of political discourse, such as freedom, and move on to materialize, to fulfill the non-political objectives and slogans of the constitutional period. Whatever in the period of 2 decades, Reza Shah and his supporters and his aides managed to bring about to the Iranian post-constitutional period is centralization of the state, creation of the unified army, Artesh Shahanshahi, creating of an entirely new, although there were some schools prior to his time, but extensive creation of a educational system for boys and eventually for girls, the creation of a judiciary and a modern judiciary at the expense of the mujtahids and the religious establishment, creation of a centralized financial system, and issuance of the banknote. All of these were considered as a major objectives and communication, of course, across the country. All of this were considered at the great achievements of the constitutional, great achievements of the Pahlavi era at the expense of the political dimension of the constitutional revolution. It's not a surprise, therefore, that in 1941, when Reza Shah abdicates, we see almost the continuity of the political debate of the age of the Constitution re-emerging in this period of what I would call it a chaotic democracy up to 53. And thereabout, you would see the continuity of that kind of authority of the autocratic power of the ruler, with what Montesquieu has pointed out, vis-a-vis the wishes of the people. And that continues really up to the revolution. As I pointed out, in the post-constitutional, in the post-revolution of 1979, you still see the same features. You still see the same debate that here we have witnessed in the Lawaya of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. We can go beyond that. There's plenty that can be said about the Pahlavi period and the post-Pahlavi period. But I think probably I've talked more than enough. And it's the time that if people are not tired, it's the time to question or debate or any idea, any comments that I would appreciate.
Thank you, Dr. Amanat. That was truly fascinating. And although we went way over time, I couldn't stop you and I wanted to keep listening. So
my apologies. You should have done
No. It was wonderful. We do have a lot of questions. We won't obviously have the time to answer many of them, but there are a few that I wanted to just review with you, and hopefully we can do them quickly. And one of the main questions we got were a lot of people wanted to get a source of all the books and articles that you mentioned. So if you share those with us, we will be glad to put it on the event page, and we'll also email it to everyone so they can access them. So thank you for those.
Just add one sentence. There is a entry again in ill-fated Encyclopedia Iranica, which is available online, on the idea of historiography of the Qajar and the Pahlavi period that I have produced. And there are plenty of sources up to the time when that article came out. There is much more that I would be happy to share.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our first question is from Hossein Jawahirian. There's a chicken and egg relationship between freedom and democracy. How can the puzzle be cracked? I.e., is it possible to achieve one without the other one?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think in some respect, this was implicit in my remarks. That is the only way that those liberties could be materialized if this political dimension of it would be set aside. And that's the Pahlavi solution. They tried to create a society with certain liberties in terms of women, in terms of the middle classes, in terms of education, in terms of the lifestyle, and all the characteristics of a middle class, of a secularized middle class, at the expense of, first of all, isolating the religious community who was against it, as we saw in the example of Nuri, and secondly, to basically confine and restrain any kind of a form of opposition. That's unfortunately what Iranian society is paying for now, because they have been, in effect, not well schooled in the ideology and dimensions of liberty. To answer is yes, there are secular liberties, but in my opinion, as you said, it's chicken and egg. One cannot really result in an in-depth form of Azadi, because of the fact that Azadi has only develops when there is a free environment of a press, freedom of speech, freedom of association.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Naveed. The Iranian left has always struggled in defining its connection to the concept of freedom. While having a historical background of resisting oppression, they also have a track record of harshly silencing any opposition. How would you characterize the role of Iranian left in the battle for freedom from the era of Haydar Khan Amouoghli up until now?
Okay, great. Well, I think this is a subject of one or more talks, but the left in general, one would say that had a kind of an intrusive, not entire, I mean the radical left, has a kind of a difficult relationship with the advocates of freedom of speech. The personality that was referred to, Haydar Khan Amouoghli, was an activist originally from Iran, brought up in the Caucasus, and then become very important, basically a terrorist who organized a number of terrors during the course of the Constitutional Revolution, including Sayyid Abdullah Behbahani, one of the two major clerical supporters of the Constitution, whose presence was important because, like Tabatabai said, Muhammad Tabatabai, they were bringing certain legitimacy into the new order. Also assassination of a number of other figures, and then himself was assassinated later during the final episode of the Jangal movement. Following that, if you like, much of the time the Tudeh party was not a great advocate of liberty, and nor was the left of the Mujahideen or the Fadayan Khaw. Fadayan, of course, paid a deep service to democracy and the age of free speech, but only to the level that it would have served them their own interests. The same, probably more or less, is true about the Mujahids. But generally speaking, it's yet that I would see in the agenda of the left a major item at the top being freedom of speech or the freedom of association. Rather, if they would have come to power, which never happened in Iran, I doubt that they would have been anything different from the Soviet model or the Chinese model or some other model. If you listen to many of the groups of the left, not Fadayan, but many others, you would see that there was a whole range of models that they wanted to adopt, and few of them, in my opinion, were sincere about their claim of restoring freedom.
Great, thank you. I think we can end the questions on this one because we got many of them from many different attendees. So I'll kind of abbreviate or summarize it. As a historian, are you hopeful, like many Iranians, that the recent movement started by the brave young women of Iran will lead to any real change?
That's a great question to end our conversation. I am very, very proud of the women and men who risked their lives and stood courageously during the course of the last year to protest, even at the expense of being beaten up, losing some of their limbs and their eye, and ending up in prison, as many of them are. I think this gives me certainly a hope. I don't think it's going to be a miracle. I don't think it's going to be a short term. I don't think it's something from the outside. Outside may have a very important function, but what I would see that something would happen inside Iran, and perhaps gradually. And the fact that we see a whole generation of the young that are now thinking differently, that are now being transformed. Therefore, I would see this moment of the last protest movement as a turning point. We are dealing with a new generation. We are dealing with a new Iran. So my hope is there. And I think it may sound to many of you that the etymology to which I have referred is just an etymology. But to me, it speaks more than that. There is a very functional relations between these three components, which I think is this is very genuine, this is very inherent into the Iranian world, and I think it's going to survive.
Thank you very much. On that positive note, we all hopeful for a beautiful future for Iran and for Azadi. And I want to personally thank Dr. Amanat for accepting our invitation to be here today and to doing this talk on this particular subject. We are honored always to have you at Farhang Foundation. And as you mentioned earlier, hopefully one day soon in person, we will have you, although this method is much more accessible to hundreds of viewers from across the world, as we had hundreds of viewers from across the world join us today for this exclusive talk. As always, please visit farhang.org for all the latest upcoming events, talks, and programs. We thank you all for joining us from across the globe for today's talk, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Once again, Dr. Amanat, thank you very much for taking the time out of your Saturday to be with us, and I thank all the audience members who joined us today.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day, and farewell. Bye-bye.